BookTube, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you about the books that I read in August. During the month, I read 17 books. Of the 17 books, I've already told you about 15 of them. That's because I participated in not one, not two, but 3 readathons. The first readathon was Booktubeathon, which started in July and carried over to August. And 5 of the books that I read during August, I included in my July recap, because at the time when I was doing my July recap, I had just wrapped up my Booktubeathon videos, and so I told you about those books already. Then I took a week to recover from Booktubeathon, and then the next week I participated in the Book Swapathon, and then the next week I did the Women in Translation Readathon. During Book Swapathon, I read 4 books, and I talked about those in my Book Swapathon recap. And then the week after that, as a matter of fact, there was a little bit of an overlap between Book Swapathon and the Women in Translation Readathon. And during the Women in Translation Readathon, I read 6 books. And so I talked about those books in my Women in Translation Readathon recap. And so of the 17 books that I read in August, I've already told you about 15 of them. I have 2 books that I didn't include in any recaps, and those 2 books I no longer have. The first one was Offshore by Penelope Fitzgerald, and I got that from the library and I returned it. And then the other book was I Funny, which even though it wasn't a part of the readathon, I read it during a readathon. So I talked about that one too, and so I've already mentioned now all the books. So I won't go into detail about any of the books. Some of them I no longer have, but in the interest of completeness, I'll tell you the list of 17 books that I read in August and insert pictures where I no longer have the books. So if you're interested, you can click the links down below and see where I talked about the books a little bit more in depth, so you can hear more of my thoughts about them. These are the 17 books that I read in the order in which I read them. First was Rancher's Dream by B.J. Daniels. Next was Little Paris Bookshop by Nina George. Next was The Nerdiest, Wimpiest, Dorkiest, I Funny Ever by James Patterson and Chris Grabenstein. I already gifted this to someone. Next was Things Bright and Beautiful by Anbara Salam. This was a win from a giveaway on Jen Campbell's channel. Next was Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. This one I got from the library and I already returned it. Then between Booktubeathon and the Book Swapathon, I only read 1 book, and that's because I kept rereading certain parts of this book, so it took me a really long time, even though it was a short book to begin with. But it was Offshore by Penelope Fitzgerald. This was a Man Booker Prize winning novel, and at the end I gave it 3 stars because I just kept rereading certain sections of it and not really feeling like I had a good footing on the book, which was probably appropriate since it was a novel that took place on a houseboat. So that was the only book that I completed during that week. And the next week was Book Swapathon, and for the Book Swapathon I read A Horse Walks into a Bar by David Grossman. This is the 2017 Man Booker International Prize winner. Then I read Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren. This is translated from the Swedish popular children's book. Everyone knows the story. Then I read Dubliners by James Joyce, which is a collection of short stories where Dublin is the main character and everything else and every other character centers around their lives in Dublin. Then I read Cows, Pigs, Wars and Witches by Marvin Harris, and this is an anthropological / sociological exploration on some of the questions that we think we know the answers to, like why do Hindus worship cows, and why do Jews and Muslims refuse to eat pork, and why have witches managed to stage such a successful comeback in today's popular culture. I did a buddy read of this one during Book Swapathon. I wasn't finished during the Book Swapathon, but I spoke about it in my vlog. The author made a few points that I disagreed with, either on his premise or his conclusion. It is a little bit old, and so there are a few things that are no longer as relevant as they were when the book was first published in 1974, but still a really good read. Then I read some books for the Women in Translation Readathon, which the objective was to read books that were written by women in another language, some of which were at least translated by women translators into English. And the first of those books was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. This one was translated from the Japanese, and it was an exploratory look at the life of a convenience store worker. Our main character was a 36-year-old woman who at 18 she'd started working in a convenience store and kind of lost any passion or any interest in doing anything else because she saw her job at the convenience store as fulfilling her obligation to the society, and so she had ordered her entire life around performing the routines of her job. Very interesting satirical look at a job that most of us probably take for granted, and written in such a way that even though the character was sociopathic and not quite endearing, it made for a really interesting read. Then I read Elena Ferrante's The Beach at Night, which at 41 pages, where 20 of those pages were illustrations. It seemed to have been written with a child audience in mind. However, the language contained profanity and the themes were a little gruesome. Elena Ferrante is an Italian writer, and this one was translated into English by Anne Goldstein, who seems to work exclusively with this author. Then I read The Elegance of the Hedgehog by Muriel Barbary. This was translated from the French by Alison Anderson, and it's set in France, takes place in a residential hotel where three unlikely characters meet and change each other's lives forever. To take a break, I read another in the James Patterson iFunny middle school series, and I read the first in that series, iFunny by James Patterson and Chris Grabenstein. I also gifted that book away, so I no longer have that one. Then I returned to my Women in Translation readathon. I read Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. I did a buddy read of this one with K.A. Hi, K. This, of course, was translated from Italian by the same translator, Anne Goldstein, and the novel tells the story of a 30-something-year-old woman who's been abandoned by her husband, and in this one she struggles to reconcile what her life is like now after she has lost her husband, and with the breakup she seems to have lost a good chunk of her sanity and her life. Then I read The Fox Was Ever the Hunter by Herta Müller, and she's a Romanian author who fled to Berlin at the end of the Ceausescu regime, and in this novel she created a story about the end of the Ceausescu dictatorship and what that meant for the characters that were living in that time. I was doing a buddy read of this one with Sean the Book Maniac, but he eventually abandoned it, which I completely understand because it was pretty difficult to get through, but I was happy that I was done. Then the final book that I read for the Women in Translation readathon, and indeed for the month of August, was the summer book by Tove Jansson, who is from the Swedish-speaking region of Finland. So this book was written in Swedish, even though the author is from Finland. Did I get that right? Yes. This novel is told through a collection of vignettes which show a 6-year-old girl who's spending the summer with her aging grandmother as they both deal with the loss of the little girl's mother and how they are able to connect and support each other through this difficult time. And so that's it. These are the books that I read in August. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you read any of these and want to talk a little bit more about them. And click the links to my readathon recaps where you can get a little bit more in-depth information about what I thought about the book, especially while I was reading it, because you know, at the end of the month sometimes it's difficult to remember all the feelings and all the emotions that these books prompted within me. So thanks for watching. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll talk in the comments. So until next time, happy reading.